All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming tonight. I'm looking forward to this presentation. Looking forward to having a good conversation, answering some questions, having a good discussion, because this is a topic that I've been thinking about for a very long time. Actually, about as long as I've been doing professional war games. And Sebastian just prompted me to start with my bio, and that's good because I was going to start with my bio because the origins of this briefing and my biography, professional biography, they don't make any sense at all to outside of the context of CNA and my career there. So I actually began. I graduated Georgetown University myself. So I had a master's in Arab studies. I graduated in 2004. So I've been out for a little bit, but it's nice to be back in the Georgetown community tonight. And I just noted that my degree is in Arab studies. So how did I end up from there to here? And that's really the part that you have to understand kind of how CNA works. CNA is a federally funded research and development center. We work primarily for the Department of the Navy. We are the Department of the Navy's FFRDC. But we work with other DoD entities and other entities in the US government very extensively. As a result, FFRDCs were created to kind of answer the most pressing issues of various agencies within the executive branch. So we tend to have to go towards those questions that are most pressing for our sponsors, that is the Navy and DoD. So when I first got into my professional life in 2004, the war in Iraq was raging. I was one of a small cadre of students who ended up specializing in Arab studies, made that decision before September 11th happened, but then went to school after the events of September 11th. And so there was this whole paradigm shift in what we thought we were going to do and what we've ended up doing. But when I first got out of Georgetown, my very first job was teaching about the Middle East, teaching about Arab culture, teaching about Islam as part of pre-deployment courses for soldiers and other US government personnel who were going abroad. Eventually, I branched out and was doing a lot of training, some very specialized training sometimes that involved not just kind of the classroom teaching of how to understand the Middle East, but getting into an analysis of jihadist groups and what motivates them. Why do individuals join jihadist groups? What are the trends in jihadi TTPs? How are insurgents and jihadis different? Like, what are their different ambitions and goals? And that led me down this course of analysis that defined kind of the rest of my career at CNA. You will hear me talk a lot about adversary analytics, which is essentially trying to understand trying to understand our adversaries. Why do they do what they do? What can we do to understand that? What can we do to interfere with that? So when I got to CNA as a young Arabist, I actually vowed that I would never work on any project that did not involve my use of the Arabic language. And that lasted for about 9 months because, as I said, as an FFRDC, we go where the policy priorities are. And there certainly wasn't enough work to keep an Arabist like me occupied. So I began to diversify, working for other teams, doing all sorts of other things. But one of the areas where I could use my background in Arab studies was with the wargaming team. And I began working for Peter Perla and Ed McGrady as a slide monkey, but one who was interested in wargaming because, like so many of us who have gotten into wargaming, it started when we were young nerds. I began my gaming interest when I was a kid doing Dungeons and Dragons, of course, got into other role-playing games. And then as the board game renaissance happened, to kind of follow that crest as well. So I've been a lifelong gamer, and I was thrilled to find out that I was working at a place that was actually implementing war games. So I was able to get in with the wargaming team at that level. I have worked at CNA for almost 14 years now, and I've been doing games with CNA for almost that entire time, albeit in very different capacities. But I started as chopping on slides and eventually giving inputs, and then playing the red team as parts of games. And it started from a Middle East angle. I have played a very good Bashar al-Assad. I've played Hezbollah through over the years, but it led me to think about all the different ways that there are red teams and how a red team can be used. And that's the provenance of this game. Or I'm sorry, not of a game. This is a presentation. All right, hold on one second. I am working on two computers here, because two computers that work halfway decently are the equivalent of one that does everything all the time. Like I said, I've worked at CNA for almost 14 years, and I have done a whole lot of different kinds of research. And wargaming has been one that I've perennially come back to. I began CNA looking at Middle East issues, in particular jihadist groups and insurgents, but that striving to understand those adversary groups kind of led me down the path of adversary analytics. And I had the good fortune of working for Ken Gause, who is a world-renowned expert in North Korea leadership and decision-making. I also benefited from working for Ken Gause because he is a consummate delegator. He loves to push work down to the people that work with him. So by the very fact that I was working for Ken, that meant that I would be working on North Korea issues. And so I began studying North Korea, but not having gone to school to learn about North Korea. My main vehicle for learning about Pyongyang was through war games. And I began working, working war games, beginning to execute them as an assistant facilitator, again, still chopping on slides, but then doing more and more research into what needed to go into the games to make those games effective for our sponsors. So this briefing comes about from this intersection of trying to understand our adversaries from an analytic point of view, really digging into what drives them, what motivates them, and then seeing the consummate utility of wargaming to bring those lessons out. And that is where we are for this presentation, right at the intersection of adversary analytics and wargaming. So what I want to do this evening is walk through, from my perspective, from our perspective at CNA, what games are for, and then talk about adversary analytics. And as I showed in that last Venn diagram, how do they connect? Because the way that you structure your games is essential for generating the outcomes and the objectives that you are trying to achieve with that. And so every element of a professional war game needs to be developed with that in mind. And that is absolutely the case for developing a red team as well. So these few bullet points are straight out of CNA's materials when we are trying to broach the idea of a game with a potential sponsor. Usually they have come to us and they say something along the lines of, we want a war game. And then we go back to them and ask, well, why do you want a war game? And so we've identified several different approaches that a war game can take, several different reasons that you might want to do a war game, these different outcomes. So a lot of it begins with the shaping of a concept, because the games that we do at CNA, are not always very tactical war games. We're not doing models and simulations. The games that we develop are typically boutique games that are looking at a very specific issue for a very specific sponsor who has a very specific set of questions. And so we cultivate the game to really delve down into whatever that issue is. And it takes an analytic process to kind of unpack that. And it begins with understanding what you want the game for. So sometimes the sponsors will have an idea that they need to other people to understand. Right? Games provide an excellent venue for socializing concepts, for convening different groups, for putting one person's idea out there or one command's idea, getting others to understand and creating that venue for that exchange of ideas. And we call that socializing a concept. You can also explore a concept by digging down into the weeds a little bit of what does this really mean. You can do this a lot with different war plans or any kind of plan, any kind of contingency. You can do it with ideas of reorganization, logistics. There are so many different concepts that are vital to DoD that really might sound good on paper, but when you start to peel it back, there are a lot of questions that come out of that. Because as we know, very often headlines and bumper stickers are what make it into policy, but those need to be fleshed out a bit more, and war games provide a great venue for that. And I am looking at you, National Defense Strategy. Every 4 years we run into this at like, hey, what does great power competition mean? We don't know. That actually sounds like a really good thing. Okay, but now we've moved on to integrated deterrence. What is that? I don't know. It sounds good. Let's unpack it in a game and figure out what that actually means. By exploring the different dynamics of a concept, you can then move on into refining that. Once you have a pretty good idea of something, whatever it is, something that you might want to do, you can refine it. And games, again, provide an excellent venue for doing that. You can also use games to model some kind of process that you might not understand. This is where rehearsal of concept drills come in, in very large play. You can, just by walking through any kind of plan, whatever it is, you can fully understand the dynamics, things you might not have thought of. And that's what we like to call modeling a process. Different from computer modeling, but it's more the human experiential side of it. And of course, as you all know, if you have any connection with Sebastian at all, games are a fantastic tool for education and can be used in a wide variety of ways for educating the players. And usually this cuts across different categories as well. So education and learning is always going to be part of any professional war game. But sometimes you wanted to create a game that has the discrete purpose of educating players, which gives a slightly different tack. So that's generally when we talk about what we use games for. That's the approach that we're taking at CNA, and that's the approach that I look at when I'm developing a game. And all of that comes down to the essential question of what do you need out of your game? What do you need to learn from your game? And we spend a lot of time crafting the objectives, like why is it that you actually want a game? What do you need to know? And depending on what your problem is, you may or may not need a red team to explore that. Let me pause for a moment because I have been using the term red team a lot. And kind of assuming that people know that because it is a term of art. But if there are folks in the audience who don't know what I mean by a red team, what I mean is that when you play a game, frequently you will talk about having a blue team and a red team. The blue team traditionally is the United States. So US forces, it could be the US government, whatever roles you expect the players to take on, if they're acting in the role as the United States, making decisions as they would in real life or making decisions on behalf of the United States, we call that the blue team. But in any good war game, you have an opponent, you have an adversary of some kind, and that is going to be the red team. So depending on who the adversary is or the rival, there's kind of a big five set of adversaries that have been identified in policy documents. And we've done war games, about all of them, but you really need to understand what that red team is for, who is the adversary, and what you need to understand about an adversary for that game. So that's a red team. The other color that you might hear associated with war games is green. And we often use the term green team when we're talking about allies and partners if we're doing a game that incorporates the United Kingdom or Japan or the Republic of Korea, our close allies, partners that might participate in any kind of contingency. That's what we call the green team typically. And I've seen a whole rainbow of colors depending on the game and how it's structured. You might throw in different colors to designate the different teams, but the big three that we really see is the blue team, the red team, and the green team. So not all games need a red adversary. Even those situations that might have an adversarial component to them. So one of the first things that you have to decide is, does your game need a red team? And then you need to understand what you might need to understand about the red team. So let me give you an example of some games where you might not need a red team. There are games that we have run at CNA that are, there's a series that are called the Operational Troop to Task war games. And these games are really very much manpower games. You can almost look at it as a human resources kind of game. And the questions that we're exploring there are typically when a command or an office or some organization has a structural problem of the kind that organizations do, and they need to change things up. They need to understand what it is they do, just like in office space. What is it you say you do here? That is a surprisingly effective question when said without a whole lot of sass. But you're trying to understand what someone's job is and what their organization does can be invaluable when you're trying to set goals and objectives. So, but in those games, it is absolutely a game. There are mechanics, there are turns that you play. But you don't need an adversary for that. You might need a scenario that they are working against, but you don't necessarily have to have a red team or anyone to make decisions, on behalf of a red team that you're working against. Any sort of game that involves just one side, you don't need a red team for. You can also do games that involve working through scenarios, not necessarily the OT3 games that I was just talking about, but if you are trying to explore concepts and understand options for dealing with some kind of scenario, you don't always need a red adversary in there. The focus might be the learning just on blue, but it all depends on the kind of questions that you might have. One other thing, as I was sitting here thinking about games that do or do not need adversaries, where you might not need a red team, I was thinking about drawing a lot from hobby games, that there is a way to use cards, as a mechanic, if you're trying to make scenarios more interesting, or if you want something for the players to react to in a dynamic kind of way, you can craft the scenario using cards. And I've long wondered about the possibility of generating an automa for a game. I haven't actually done it, so I would love to hear if someone has successfully used an automa. I'm sure there are people out in the audience who've played Scythe and are familiar with the concept of an artificial player that will take turns, as a real player. That is something that I'm sure can be explored in this space. That I would like to see as another way to play a game without a red team, but I haven't seen it done personally myself. So if you do decide, however, that your problem, whatever it is, whatever you're designing the war game for, needs a red team, then it is really important that you spend some time thinking about what kind of red team you might need. A lot of times, the idea of having a red team doesn't get a whole lot of thought ahead of time. And I say this from my own experience, having played Red and developed Red for developed games with red teams. We'll often hear from sponsors who want a game. It's like, yeah, okay, well, the game will look at this and we'll have an active red, right? And when someone says that they'll have an active red, it means that there will be a red team that makes decisions in real time, creates that dynamic, but they're making decisions that will help move the game forward, help set the pace for the decisions that the players as a whole, need to make. And, in theory, if it is an adversary, those will probably be adversarial decisions, and you're trying to understand how that impacts the dynamic. But there are a lot of ways that you can structure an active red team. So based on my experience, I've identified 4 different models for having an active red team that all have their uses at various times. I've been a part of games that use these. I've designed games that use these. They all have their place, but it's really worth unpacking for a little bit what the different roles and functions of a red team might be. But I see that there is some activity in the chat as we're going ahead. Before I get into these active red models, and because this is a more interesting slide than the last one, if there's any questions, Sebastian, do you want to throw them out there, or how do you want to do this?
Yeah, so we have some questions. I asked for an explanation from one of them, so while I wait for that, I'll ask the questions. Do you believe the best games are made when the sponsor internally decides what they want a war game, that they want a war game, or when you convince them that a war game is best suited for their question?
So I would say it's probably more the latter. However, there is always an element of dialogue, right? It's never just a one-way street. Someone does not come to us and say, CNA, give us a war game. And we say, okay, here's a war game. The first question we ask, comes back to that slide I had of the different kinds of war games is, okay, so you need a war game. Why? And a lot of times the answer to that might be, because my boss said we need to do a war game, or we need to war game this out, is something we hear. But we do get a lot of people who don't understand like what war games are used for. I think there's a lot of people have learned a lot more throughout the Department of Defense and the U.S. government, in general, what games are, what the utility of war games is, and how they can be used. But in my experience, typically a sponsor will come and say like, hey, we want a war game, and they may know about games and how to use them, or they may not. But there is inevitably going to be a dialogue and a discussion where we try to understand the problem, like why do you want a war game, and then craft the game to that end. So I don't think it's a binary between those 2 options of, they want a war game, or it's a question that's appropriate for a war game. But it is absolutely an issue of finding the questions that a war game would be suited for. And it is, I'm a firm believer that you can war game almost anything but it's not always going to be interesting, not always going to be valuable. But there usually is, with the kind of sticky problems that the Department of Defense is working with, there is a lot of room for exploring that unknown territory, and games do excel at that. But it's a matter of crafting understanding the problem, understanding the question, and then crafting the questions and crafting the war game to address the questions in an appropriate way. That's a process that can take weeks or sometimes even months as we go through and try to figure out what it is that needs to be done.
So another question is about the question of pink teams, or when red teams and white teams essentially control or mix together for some game purposes. Where does that lie in your model here?
Yeah. All right. So I totally forgot about white teams. We'll talk about the white team or the white cell. The white team or the white cell is used to refer to the control group. So that would be the facilitator. If I design a game and I am running that game, I will be kind of the head of the white cell, and everyone else who is kind of on that team, usually CNA staff, will be part of the white team. They make the decisions. They help to keep the game going from the meta level. Think of the white team as the dungeon master, right? So the question is, about a pink team is when you have kind of a trusted agent who is part of the white cell, is one of the dungeon masters, but is also playing on the red team. That can be a useful tool to incorporate into that. If you are concerned with keeping your red team aligned with the objectives of the game. So I'm glad for the question, because it's not one that I had touched on in thinking through this. So I think the way it fits into the models, it's not one of these kind of 4 models that I'm going to talk to, but it's more of a facilitation role that can be used to assure the outcomes of the games that you would like to see. Usually they're bringing the red team along and making sure that the red team will understand the white cell guidance. I've also seen, because I work with some zany people, a cyan team where it's a light blue team that does the same thing, where they're kind of the white cell's trusted agent with the blue team to kind of bring them along. And like I said, there's a whole rainbow of colored teams that you can make use of in your games.
So those are all of our questions so far, so you can press on.
Cool. Awesome. All right. So I have several models for how you might structure an active red team. So the very first one is actually a very common model that I call the min-max model of a red team, right? And there is a lot of utility to the min-max game, but it does have its limitations as well. So anyone who's played role-playing games might be familiar with the term min-max, meaning that you minimize some attributes while maximizing other attributes, so that you pump your strength up to 18 while you drop your intelligence to 3, and that's perfectly fine because you really want your super buff fighter to be there, to be the tank, for the party. But that indicates on the player's part an active decision to play up one angle while playing down another. What I've seen happen with many red teams is that they make that decision, but not necessarily consciously of the fact that they are playing up one set of attributes while playing down another. Typically, what will happen in a min-max red team scenario is that someone will be playing a very aggressive red player. There will be a wartime scenario, and they will come to the map and say, well, I have 5,600 ballistic missiles, and I have this many tells. That means that I can launch this many missiles per hour, per day, and I'm just going to do that on the very first day because I can. They're looking at the capabilities on paper, right? They're looking at what is possible technically, and then playing to the maximum extent possible of that red team. You can use that model to an extent to kind of have shock and awe, on a blue team. You can reveal weaknesses in the blue team's plans, or what the current state or the art of the understanding of the adversary might be by taking that approach. However, the problem of doing that is that it very often, you're in reality, you're probably not going to see an adversary launch all of their missiles as rapidly as possible, for a whole variety of reasons. And so what you're doing is you're minimizing the political decision-making factors, the structural and organizational factors that might drive a red team. You are minimizing the fundamental organizational ability of that adversary to actually generate the firepower that might be insinuated by an order of battle. You see this a lot. You could see this with North Korea, for example, which very often you might get whiffs of this in punditry as well. Well, people will talk about North Korea has the largest army, in the world. Yes, well, technically, the number of men and women that are in the North Korean military is enormous. They have a lot of artillery. That does not necessarily give any thought to the fact of, well, in what condition is the maintenance? How have they maintained that artillery? What has been maintained and what has not been maintained? In a real scenario, what might they actually do? So if you're designing a game with a min-max kind of adversary, you can expect that a very aggressive red that is going to use a lot of firepower, often early on, and you're going to have a lot of discussions about, well, is that really possible? Can you really do that? And the min-max player is going to say, well, yes, of course I can. Look at this order of battle. But the analysis isn't going to fully support that if you dig down into it. Where the value, though, is, as I said, this can be very important for educating players that, holy crap, there is a threat out there that I didn't fully appreciate. I didn't appreciate the depth of the adversary's potential ability here. Min-max players will often bring up a lot of capabilities that an adversary might have that others haven't thought about. Min-max players have often thought about how evil they can make their own red team, and they want to cause trouble for the blue team. It's very fun to play a min-max red player, because you say, well, this looks like it could be possible without any real world constraints. We're just going to do it. But the problem again is, if you have a min-max red team playing and you don't understand what those constraints are, that can skew your analysis on the back end. Right? Saying that something is theoretically possible on paper is worlds apart from any of those real world constraints that might actually shape the decisions of our adversary and their real world behavior, much less real world performance of those adversaries in any kind of a conflict. So that's our min-max kind of red team. Another kind of red team that you might see is a red team pulled from the multiverse, right? So in this kind of game, typically this kind of red team is going to be seen a lot in games where there is a particular scenario that blue needs to exercise, right? You need to be prepared for the fact that, all right, in our last game, the min-max player said that hordes of barbarians can swarm over the mountains at a moment's notice. We have to be prepared for that. So we're going to create a scenario to defend against that contingency. Let's test our ability to play in that scenario, right? And so blue is going to work on a plan to play the game, to understand their capabilities and the red capabilities. The reason I say this is the multiverse red team is because very often in this kind of game, there will be a stipulation of the scenario at the beginning. And many people might be familiar with the term, don't fight the scenario. And it's because in order to get to a scenario that will exercise Blue's plan, you have to make several layers of assumptions, usually, that X has happened, Y has happened. There has been political tensions brewing between these two countries. And then we make up a reason why our president is insulted, that their president said something terrible. We have to make up a reason that there was some sort of accident at the border, and it has created these things, this situation that will then lead to a conflict. What you will hear sometimes from red teams that are red players, rather, that are dropped onto a red team that is pulled from the multiverse, is they'll say things like, well, that wouldn't really happen because that's not how the decisions are made in this country. Like, why would we, send all of our barbarian hordes over the border? Because we actually need them for civil defense. So we're not going. Why would that happen? Or if that happens, it indicates that something is fundamentally broken in the capital of this adversary city, like that it does not pass muster with me as an expert who understands our adversary. Why would they be doing this? And so that's where the answer, that we as facilitators and you as a game designer would have to give them is, don't fight the scenario, right? And what you're doing is you're pulling a scenario that is divorced from the current reality, but you're doing it for a distinct analytic purpose of testing Blue's preparedness for a scenario that might possibly happen, that they might be prepared for something similar to happen, because this is about Blue's preparedness and Blue's ability to deal with contingencies. In the real world, we're not going to know, what drives, what is going to be the trigger that leads to a conflict, right? We have to imagine it. And red team analysts can pick apart the scenarios infinitesimally and say, well, this wouldn't happen because of X, Y, and Z. We need a red team to suspend their disbelief while we pull a scenario from the multiverse, but we then need them to suspend their disbelief, but then make a decision as that adversary would in that multiverse. All right. So suspend your disbelief, suspend any sort of understanding of the political dynamics that brought us there, but now make decisions as that adversary would, so that we can kind of understand and play and exercise that scenario, as deeply as we can. Another trick that you might find during this multiverse play is that at some point in the middle of the war, somebody is going to say, someone on the red team, well, I still don't understand why we really started this war. And so I'm not able to make my next decision because I don't know if this is still in my interest or not, right? So that's where a red team from the multiverse might need to be coached once again as to the objectives and the outcomes of the game. The red team needs to be let in on the idea of the analysis that you're trying to generate. And they need to be socialized to the outcomes that you are looking to achieve. And this becomes this is a particularly poignant point when you're dealing with that multiverse angle of red team models. A third type of red team is similar to the multiverse model, but I'll call it alternative paths. And this is more focused on looking at potential divergent points in the future based on decisions when we don't know the full impact of what might drive those decisions, right? So let me give you an example. The alternative paths red team is going to be very useful when you are looking into alternative futures, when you need to have one blue scenario, because blue only has the time and the resources and the constraints to come up with one kind of scenario, but we don't know where our adversary is going to be in the future, right? So you might want to have a red team that is playing on different paths. So for example, if you want to stipulate that there's we are planning for a war fight 10 years in the future. Are we going to be, we know from our research that the adversary is, investing today in a lot of ballistic missiles and a lot of 5th generation aircraft, for example. But how is it going to favor that development over time? We don't know. There are a lot of things that might shape that decision between now and then. So we need our red players to kind of imagine the alternate futures in which their red teams exist. So we need them to kind of come up with a fictional narrative for the red team that says, we have, starting in 2022, going out to 2032, we have made these investments that are going to bolster our ballistic missile, technology to this degree, and that is going to shape our warfighting plans. Or we are going to forget the ballistic missile tack, and we are going to focus only on advanced fighters, right? And so we're going to cultivate a red team that has developed TTPs, tactics, techniques, protocols, and developed a strategy that is leveraging that angle. So you can have a red team that will play out these different kinds of adversaries that are all rooted in the same analysis and understanding of where the adversary is coming from, but making these kind of assumptions that lead up to that. And you will end up with a panoply of different red teams that can be used in different scenarios. So this is very helpful when you are examining future, especially future scenarios, especially at the high strategic level, but it can also play out, when you're looking at the tactical level, if you're trying to understand individual investments. But you might want to understand, well, how would an adversary react to this kind of intervention in the near future, and how would it shape them, 10 years down the line? Let's imagine that this adversary is greatly impacted by climate change, and it shapes their decision space in this whatever kind of way. How is that going to shape the Reds' decisions in the future? You still need a red team that has a deep understanding of the adversary in this case, because they need to do the analysis. They need to internalize the analysis based on what they understand today, but then supported with those analytic assumptions that you make to get them to the future. And so when you are creating red teams that are on analytic paths, frequently you'll need players that are adaptive to that environment, that can switch it off and say, like, all right, today we're playing ballistic missile red, whereas yesterday we were playing advanced fighter red, and then tomorrow we're playing the same red adversary, but who has been devastated by climate change, and their crops haven't come to borne fruit in 5 years. So they have to root it in kind of a fundamental understanding of the adversary, but are playing these different roles based on again, the analytic need that Blue has, and that you as the war gamer have given them going into the game. And the final model of having an active red is kind of the most detailed and model that requires the deepest understanding of the adversary, and that is when you're actually striving for emulation of an adversary. By emulation, what I mean is that you work to get to a very fine understanding of the deep intricacies of adversary decision-making. Very often in emulations, emulating games, you will have individual players playing individual real-world people. So you will have someone who is playing the supreme leader of a country, and you will have someone who is playing the minister of defense of that country, and you will have someone who is playing their diplomatic, their head of diplomacy, so that you can understand the dynamics between them. When you do an emulation game, the results that you're going to get out of that are going to reveal a lot about the adversary in particular, and a lot more about how the adversary might really respond to Blue actions. These are often games that focus on very discrete scenarios. What would happen if there was a inadvertent conflict at the border, between these two countries, and we're building to a crisis. You have an emulation to really fine tune your understanding of the decision-making practices of the adversary. It is very difficult to get that degree of fidelity. And it's hard to get experts on our adversaries. So these are usually used in very discrete circumstances. Also, because they become so hyper-focused on minute decisions, it's difficult to look at, for example, an entire campaign or a war game that needs to understand dynamics over many years. You're really trying to understand how an adversary might respond to a very, very specific kind of scenario in order to understand blue options and how blue might work with that system of that the adversary has. And it cultivates the blue's understanding of the adversary, helps to cultivate their understanding of what their options are and how they can have the most impact in any particular kind of scenario. So these are 4 different models that I have seen, that I have used over the years. And I that's kind of a lot to cover on one slide. So I think at this point, I'll pause and take any questions. We can have like to hear any thoughts or anything at this point.
Hey, Chris, for now, we only have one question, so you can press on.
All right.
Oh, actually, hold on. I have a couple questions coming in right now. Of course. The first question is, when deciding on a red team, is the creativity of the adversary, i.e. being predictable or not, a critical factor of importance for red's choice of research objects, the major deciding point? So
if I'm understanding the question, I think it's about the creativity of the red team. And by that, what I'm understanding is, how much do you want a red team to kind of think outside the box and present challenges to blue, and kind of what kind of challenges do you want to present to blue? I think that is a question that cuts across all these different models, and I would say that depending on the game that you are devising, may require a more creative, out of the box thinking red, or it might require a more conservative interpretation of red. It depends on what the outcomes are. I would say, I think in my experience, when you're dealing with kind of min-max red teams, that's where you're going to see a lot of the creativity of, here's a whole set of capabilities that I have, and I'm going to use them in these crazy ways. And they have that room to be creative because they're not necessarily bound by political considerations. The Politburo is not going to actually come down on them in the game and say, actually, don't do that because that's going to interfere with our economic plan. So you can have a lot of creativity, in any of these. Min-max is one that stands out, and it helps in that regard for blue to, again, think about things that they haven't thought of before, considerations that they might not have had. It is very, it's like Mike Tyson says, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face, right? So sometimes it's very helpful for blue to get punched in the face in a war game, and a very creative min-max player can often bring that to bear. You often want creativity in multiverse and alternate path kinds of red teams as well, because you need someone who, but those kinds of decisions are going to be more rooted in an understanding of the decision-making processes and our adversaries' true desired outcomes and where they might end up. But in those scenarios, you also might want someone who is a creative thinker. It doesn't mean that they're a cuckoo bananas out of the box thinker, but someone who is thinking creatively, who wants to push the envelope, who might have an understanding that is not shared by the blue team. And so they might want to lean into that creativity to advance that idea and socialize the players to that possibility. But it's not necessarily in opposition to any one of these models or not. It's more of a tone and understanding the bounds of the creativity that you are asking for that red player. It is often useful. A lot of creativity comes out of the constraints. So by putting constraints on a red team or any kind of creator, you can force a lot of creativity and force some thinking that might not have been there before, and we generate learning through war games in that regard. Or you can let them be creative and just take them off the leash and let them go. It all depends on what you're trying to get out of your game. And I would say, as an analyst who's done many war game reports, how much analysis post game do I want to spend on trying to decide what is a useful strategy and what is a very far out of the box strategy.
So the next question is sort of multi-part, so bear with me. Are there any special considerations to be aware of for including a network of red/pink players or teams in a war game? Specifically thinking of the unique complications potentially involved in Iran's prostate network, which features multiple actors of varying degrees of autonomy and capability. Any particular active red model best suited for this task?
Yeah, that is a great question. I'm gonna pocket that one for a couple more slides, because I think as we move to the next phase of this of my presentation, that might shed some light on my thinking and my experience in that regard. But absolutely, I've thought about this. I've played with this dynamic a lot, and that's in the next spot where we talk about using a red team for adversary analytics, which again, if I wasn't clear, these models of an active red are most useful when the emphasis of your analysis is going to be on blue and what blue needs, what blue wants, and blue's outcomes. There is a whole other set of games that you can design when you are trying to understand red and trying to understand what drives and motivates red and how red works. So we're getting to that in a minute.
So Chris, you can press on then and keep going.
Okay. So adversary analytics, as I said, it shouldn't be a too much of a foreign concept. It is about knowing the enemy and knowing yourself. As Sun Tzu says, right? So I had to put the obligatory quote there because I found a cool picture of him. That's all. But when we look at adversary analytics, and I have to give credit to my former boss and mentor, Ken Gause, who led our adversary analytics team at CNA for many years. I've totally cribbed this breakdown from him. And Ken began studying our adversaries back in the 1980s when he was a Sovietologist. And he worked for someone he's still not allowed to talk about. And when the Soviet Union went away, that's when he decided that he had to kind of shift tracks and apply this to a different adversary. And he focused on North Korea. So there are 5 different layers that you can use when trying to understand an adversary. And you can approach these different layers through kind of traditional research and paper writing and that kind of analysis. But you can also use war games at every level of these layers of adversary analytics to kind of explore them. So I just apologize. I'll blow through them very quick just to give some explanation. But at the very first level, if you're going to understand your adversary, you want to understand who's who in the zoo, as we say. Who are the personalities involved? What is their background? Where are they coming from? Assembling biographies is the very basic part of understanding your adversaries, because you have to know who is in what chair, wearing what hat, at what time, and making those decisions. And so that's the very first layer of understanding an adversary, is kind of breaking that down. Once you understand the players involved, and then you can begin to understand the organizations and the systems that exist that drive our adversary. So our adversaries do not, even the most authoritarian, totalitarian dictators, do not make decisions in a bubble. There is always a support structure that feeds into their decisions. Dictators who are not answering to some constituency end up hanging on lampposts, right? So a good strong man is going to have systems below him that support him, support that decision-making process, and we need to understand what those systems are. The more complex systems are, the more we need to kind of pick them apart and understand them through case studies and perhaps through experiential learning that we can get through war games to see how they work. When we understand the political landscape that exists in and shapes adversaries' decision structures, then we can begin to do analysis on their decision-making processes. Who actually does make decisions? Who makes decisions at what levels, right? It is not always the person at the top who's making the decision. It's going to be delegated down to various levels. But what gets delegated? What gets delegated to who? We begin to understand C2, command and control structures for military.
What do you want?
Or any kind of political decision making by doing adversary analysis of our adversaries at this decision making level. Once we understand how decisions are made, where decisions are made, why decisions are made, then we can pull the thread a little bit more on why certain decisions are made and understand where those pressure points are. Like, what causes a stress reaction in a particular system, right? What are those pressure points? Why does individual X, or why does the Ministry of Reunification or whatever, why do they make a particular decision? What gets them spun up? What triggers them to make certain decisions or snap into crisis mode? We understand those pressure points, then we can begin to understand how to interact with that system. What are these so-called red lines? I don't like the term red lines. There's never one single red line, but where are you going to begin to create pressure, either so that we can stay away from that because we're not ready to deal with it, or maybe we do want to poke at a particular pressure point in order to stimulate an effect that we want. Because once we understand those pressure points, then we can begin to do some analysis of how to influence that system as a whole. If you want Kim Jong-un to make a certain set of decisions, you have to understand why he's doing it. You have to understand that whole system below him, and you have to understand why it is that they exist and what they're trying to do. Our adversaries are not irrational actors. Everyone is making a decision for some reason, and they believe it is for a good reason. Now, we may not have the same information that they do. They do not have the same information we do. They do not have the same set of concerns that we do, but we can try to understand what those are so that we can better understand the area in which our adversaries are making decisions, what they might try to do at various points, at various times, so that we can be prepared to respond and that we can shape and impact their responses moving ahead. So that's with that kind of taxonomy of understanding how We can do adversary analytics. We can begin to look at various ways that you might craft games to answer some of those various questions. And a lot of games are going to kind of cover, various levels of adversary analytics, right? So one very basic kind of game might be crafted to understand what an adversary might do in a particular scenario. So if you create a scenario, just as you would create a scenario for a blue team to respond to, you can create a scenario where you have a red team trying to make decisions, where we are trying to understand who is making decisions, what are the decision criteria that are going to be important to them, what is not going to be important to them, and we begin to understand what those pressure points are. We can use war games at a very high level to kind of socialize the idea of the complex decision-making environment that our adversaries have, that they operate in. You can explore future scenarios and see what kind of future capabilities they might bring in either current or future scenarios. There's a question of how far in the future do you want to go? Because the further out you get, the more speculative you have to be. But you can do very good speculative analysis that is based on a solid understanding of where our adversary is today. This is coming back to the alternate paths kind of adversary. You understand where they are now and where they may be, what they might want to do in the future. We can do a lot of games that really look at the systems and decision-making processes of our adversaries. And I think this is getting to that question that was asked before about the networks, talking about Iran and its network of proxies. I have a model here that's looking at North Korean decision-making and organizational structure, but you can do the exact same kind of wire diagram for any of our adversaries. And if you wanted to craft a war game where you put Iran, at the top, it is very, very useful for understanding what that network of proxies is, because you can have one kind of game that draws a line from Iran to Hezbollah. However, it's not going to be that clear cut in real life. I always used to joke that in games we would sometimes have players who were playing Iran say, "All right, I'm going to activate Hezbollah and make them do this." And it's like, activate Hezbollah? What does that actually mean? There is no button for activating Hezbollah, to make them go do something. Hezbollah is an agent. It is its own actor. They are going to make decisions on their own. They do not take orders from Iran, but they do see themselves as very close allies and partners. And they might take suggestions, but they're going to do their own thing. And there's a lot of trust. So you can understand that those two actors are going to be acting in tandem very, very frequently. Moreover, if there is, suppose there was an activate Hezbollah button, what does that actually mean? The supreme leader is not going to make a decision and call up Nasrallah. There's going to be an administrative process. There are handlers. There is an organizational structure behind these interactions. And so if we're really going to understand the systems and decision makings of our adversaries, we need to be able to model that in a way. We need to be able to create scenarios that will allow us to explore that decision space. I have been part of games. I don't remember if this is one that I designed or one that I helped to facilitate, where we put multiple adversaries who were in alliance together in a room, gave them all the same objective, but it essentially, the scenario kind of created a prisoner's dilemma, where they all wanted the same outcome, but none of them actually wanted to be the entity to cross that line first. And it created a very interesting dynamic that allowed us to understand, why is this group doing X but not Y? Why is this group also not doing Y for different reasons? And it gave us a lot of data that we could then take back and analyze for understanding the drives and motivations and cooperative structures of these particular groups. So you can absolutely use games to kind of explore this space. These kind of games do require a lot of research ahead of time. Usually the research has to be something that you've been working on previously for, you might be something that you have on the shelf that you've done a whole research and analysis on the systems, trying to understand our adversaries and what drives them. And then we test it out by putting them into a game. What do we learn about those systems? How do those systems interact? And what might drive them to do or make different decisions in different scenarios? And these games end up being a whole lot of fun as you see people scrambling. Especially this is you get to the question of creativity before. You get a lot of creativity in these kind of games as well, as players are trying to make decisions in an environment of uncertainty based on what they know and understand of the particular adversary that they are acting as. So if you can do a game that tries to understand the dynamics of our adversary's decision-making and their inner workings just on its own, what happens if you take that system that you now understand and you put it in opposition to a host of other actors, right? So in this model, what if you take that, what if we had a game to explore internal North Korean decision-making, and then you put that team, you put those actors in a room, and then you put other players in other rooms as South Korea, the United States, and China, right? And you create a scenario where everyone has to make decisions independently, but in this environment that you have simulated. One angle that I really like to take when creating games of this kind, and this is where you might want to think about the physical space that you have to play a game, that it's helpful sometimes to put different teams or different cells of the same team in the same room so that they have ostensibly perfect communication with each other, but give them different tasks and objectives so that they may or may not work together. And you kind of get a sense of how these different cells and these different groups within one larger structure might react to these outside stimuli. And you can create complex systems and you can have an observation of adversary dynamics and you can understand blue decision-making and green decision-making, how they all interact with each other, where there are points of interaction, where there are third rails that one player or another is not going to touch. But you can, by layering these different ways of understanding our adversary and creating environments to test and to stress them, you can create a lot of very interesting and exciting outcomes from your games in that regard. One of the challenges that you might come across as you create and develop more complex games like this is, what data are you actually going to collect out of there, and how do you collect it? A lot of these large games might depend on discussion and dialogue and conversations between the players. It is very difficult to collect all of that for analysis later on. And so this is where it's very useful to have very seasoned analysts who are there as rapporteurs or note takers, because taking the notes is the first layer of analysis. And they have to know what it is that they're looking for, what it is that they're trying to collect to support your data collection plan as you are creating a war game to explore these dynamics. And then, finally, you can use all of that understanding to help refine your model of how you understand the adversary, how decisions are made, and begin to think about how you might pressurize that system. How do you shape the strategic objectives and the interim goals of an adversary? As I said before, adversaries are going to make decisions based on something, and they typically believe that those decisions are advancing their end goals. So how do we understand what their end goals are? Do they have interim goals? How can we change those and impact them? Right? We can sometimes create and structure a red team. This is coming back to the emulation angle, to understand the red team itself. So whereas you might have an emulated red team that is there to help cultivate the understanding of blue's options and decision space, you can also have an emulated red team where you are really trying to get down into the weeds of what is driving particular individual decisions of an adversary, and how they might react to different stimuli and why. So as you get further on into your analysis of the adversary, really understanding what drives them, motivates them, makes them tick, you understand those pressure points and influence, and you can begin to peel it apart through a cleverly crafted war game that gets at the specific questions that you are looking to explore, based on your analysis. All right. So almost at the end here, so I'm going to press for a couple slides and then open it for discussion. So I think, coming back to the so what, like why at the end of the day is it important to think about your red team, and why did I spend so much time thinking about the different kinds of red teams and the different utilities of different kinds of red teams? And I think the very first thing is that it is really useful to think of the red team as an essential mechanic of war game design. And I use the word mechanic very deliberately. I would like people to begin to think about a red team not just as another set of players, right? We're not sitting down to play Catan, and I'm the blue piece and you're the red piece, and we're going to go through those motions. It's just how you indicate the different teams. But there is a lot of room to really analytically think about what a red team does, how the functioning of a red team contributes to the analytic outcomes of a professional war game. And therefore, the red team needs to be crafted in such a way as to advance the outcome of your game, right? You need to think about what kind of red team you're going to need. What do you need to come out of your game? What do you need that red team to do? What decision space do you need to craft for the red team based on what learning you want your game to generate? Are you trying to understand something fundamental about blue? Are you trying to understand something fundamental about red? Is it a little bit of both? Are you looking at those dynamics of interaction? There's a lot of different ways that you can cut it. And I would venture to say that probably every single war game has a slightly different interaction between red and blue that can be parsed differently, particularly if we spend the time thinking analytically about how we craft those teams and the interactions between them, and make that an essential part of game design. Moreover, it is very frequently said that the most important part of any game is having the right players. 100% true. Absolutely true for a red team as well, because you need to have the right kind of red players for your game based on the outcome. Who do you want to have there? But you also have to tell them what their job is when they show up. Are they supposed to lean in and hit blue with everything that they've got right out the front gate? Come hell or high water, this is how we're going to take this gap, and we're just going to use all of our assets in a very min-max kind of way? Or are you going to give them a scenario that you don't want them to push back on? Don't think about the political implications of what got us here. That's beyond the scope of this game. We need you to focus on your Reds' decisions and what they're going to do reasonably with the assets they have to achieve the goals we have given you for this scenario. And you're going to end up with different people in every different kind of red team that you structure. You don't always need to have someone who has dedicated her entire life to understanding every in and out of our adversary, has worked studying them for 50 years. That's not always necessary. Sometimes it is invaluable, right? And you have to know when you need to tap those people, when you don't need to, because you don't want to take someone who only thinks about the adversary day in and day out, and then give them a role where you say, yeah, don't really think too much about how the adversary might realistically respond. We just need you to be a straw man or a dummy while blue runs through their scenario. You're going to end up with a mismatch of skills. You're going to end up with frustration among your players. You're going to end up with friction in your game that you, as the moderator or facilitator, are going to have to deal with one way or another, down the line. So by thinking holistically about the red team, thinking about your red team as a mechanic that you can use in the game to produce different kinds of outcomes and effects based on your analytical need, can bring a lot of depth to your games as you move ahead. And that's all I got right now for slides, but I'm happy to stick around and field any more questions, comments, or thoughts that have come up along the way. So happy to talk.
Hey, thanks, Chris, for a great presentation. We have a couple questions that I've received both in the chat and private chat. So the first one is, can analysis framework be applied to asymmetric adversaries?
Asymmetric adversary? Well, I'm going to say yes. I'm not sure what you mean by asymmetric adversaries, because all adversaries are asymmetric in some way whatsoever. But if we're thinking about kind of the traditional understanding of asymmetric adversaries, perhaps thinking about insurgent groups in the face of the United States, I think absolutely. Adversary analytics can be done, for that. And, again, going back to the beginning of my presentation, that's how I started, was digging into jihadist groups and what drives them, because jihadist groups are fascinating in their ability to apply intellectual rigor to the dehumanization of people they don't like. And their TTPs are really driven by that. But you can understand them. You can understand what motivates them. You can understand that if they are looking to some sort of justification from a religious leader or their interpretation of a religious text, that perhaps they're not going to be restrained by care about civilian casualties. They absolutely don't care about that, because in their mind, anyone who's innocent who's killed is going straight to heaven. So you're actually doing them a favor by allowing them to be part of civilian casualties. And they'll use it to very to strategic and operational ends as well. So you can understand your adversaries. You can break down, spend a lot of time breaking down who's who in different jihadist groups, just as you can do the same for understanding who's who in the Ministry of Defense, who's who in the Kremlin. So those principles of adversary analytics can be applied to any adversary. In fact, I would say by let's remove the term adversary from it for a moment. You can use the same sort of analytical breakdown to understand green. A lot of the analysis and research that I've done at CNA outside of war games has been how to understand our allies and partners. And you're not necessarily doing that with the objective of, with any kind of malicious intent. You're not trying to necessarily pressure them or influence the system, but you do want to understand the ecosystem of political parties, and who might come to power and what their policy priorities might be. How might that impact our relationship? And therefore, how might that impact their decision-making down the line. So those same principles of understanding who's who, understanding the systems, understanding how those systems interact is a lot of basic political science. But you apply it to that understanding of an adversary. And when you bring that into a game, you can marry the value of experiential learning that you get out of war games with that analytic rigor that you get from kind of that traditional understanding of adversaries, which is rooted in political science methodologies.
So our next question asks, how often should you have any type of black swan event into a scenario, or should you try to avoid those in general?
Oh, man. So good question. I think this is a matter of preference, probably, for sure. But I stay away from black swans because they're black swans. Inherently, they can't be predicted, and you don't know how it's going to shape the outcome. So that doesn't mean that something unexpected might not happen in your game. This is why we use dice and other stochastic mechanisms to kind of create that randomness. And nothing in a war game is going to be as crazy as shit that happens in real life. Life, you cannot script how crazy things can get in reality. And if you put that into your game, people are going to push back against it. Very often saying, oh, that would never happen for analytical reasons A, B, C, D, and E. So if you inject a black swan, it might introduce an interesting discussion point, but from my perspective, there's limited analytic utility to that. Doesn't mean there's no analytic utility, but for me, I prefer to avoid black swans. But if there is someone who adores throwing black swans into their games, I would love to hear how they use it and how they've used it effectively. Because I think black swans are also fun, but not necessarily the best for getting the specific analytic outcomes that you're looking for in a game.
So another question is, how do you choose the right red player for each of the types of models you represent?
So it comes back to understanding what you want and need to get out of your game, right? So the way that we craft games at CNA, I look at it as creating a laboratory experiment, right? That we know what hypothesis we might want to test. We know what we want to try to understand better. Therefore, we create the experiment, we create the war game to specifically address those questions. So once you understand what it is you're trying to get out of the game, that should lead you to understanding one way or another to look at your red team, right? Are you looking for a red team that's not going to think a whole lot about how the Supreme Leader's breakfast decision is going to impact his mood that day? Maybe you just want to know, how many missiles they can fire and how rapidly. Maybe you're just concerned in understanding the PKIs of particular weapon systems or the survivability of different platforms. Maybe that's what you want to get out of your game, in which case you need to find a player who understands the systems. There are a lot of people who understand orders of battle very thoroughly. There are a lot of people that understand adversary weapon systems and what is being updated, what all the different variants and modifications are. You might want to find that person, or you might want to find someone who has a very extensive database of units of the adversary and knows that inside out. But you might want someone who understands how the Supreme Leader is making decisions on a very particular day based on particular circumstances. So once you understand kind of what type of red player you want, then it becomes a matter of reaching into your Rolodex or reaching into someone else's Rolodex to be like, hey, we need someone who really understands the Russian order of battle, on the in the east. So who can we find to do this? Or we really need someone who has studied Ayatollah Khamenei for 20 years to play that role. So it depends on what outcomes you're going to get, and then knowing how you're going to craft the red team, and then finding who's available. I've had many conversations where it's like, oh, this person would be really, really good for this game, but you know what, we're going to overtax them for this one. We don't need him to show up here. So and so can play red for this game. I have been involved myself in games or stepped away from the red role in games, depending on my level of understanding, right? I can say like, yeah, I can play red at this level, of the game, but I cannot play red in this degree. Like, are you looking for a red that's just, creative and has a basic understanding of the order of battle? Hey, yeah, I'm your guy. I can do that. And I can play to your game. But do you actually need someone who has a very deep understanding of this nation's, artillery systems? Hey, that's not me. Let me point you at someone else. So it's a combination of knowing what you want to get out of your game and who you know.
So another question is, what are some of the common struggles you see that red teams have when they're either doing any of the models that you mentioned, but coming into a war game for the first time?
So the biggest hurdle that I have seen, which is really what spawned this whole discussion that has been formulating in my brain, is that they will come in and say, yeah, that's not realistic. They'll push against the scenario in some way. And the reason this happens is because we will create a game for one particular reason. Like we need to understand the scenario. We need to understand the operational plan that Blue is developing for this scenario. And in order to understand how we're going to defend our partner nation in this scenario, we have to assume that the adversary has launched a full-scale invasion, and we need to be prepared for all these different contingencies, right? So then you bring in a red team of people that really understand the decision-making of that adversary, and they say, like, the hell, like there's no way they would make this decision. Why are they doing this? Like, why would they choose to invade? And I can't possibly play out this invasion to test that plan because I don't understand what it is that I'm trying to get out of this military objective. So then your role as a game designer is to square the circle. You need to be able to think about that concern ahead of time and say, all right, we know the red team is going to come in with a lot more understanding than we need them to for this scenario. So we need to craft the scenario with enough justification that will give them some understanding that they need. And you might want to do that in conjunction with red experts. There's nothing that says you have to wait till the last minute to bring your red team in, right? You want those analysts that understand red deeply, involved in the process early. So you craft the scenario to kind of get as far as you can in suspending that disbelief. Then at the game, you need to prepare your red team to say, look, this is what we're trying to get out of the game. These are the analytic objectives we need. We need you to play the game in this way. We need you to assume that you have authorized the invasion and are now making the best moves possible given this baseline of understanding, right? And all of this is, this is why I've thought of the whole presentation, because you need to understand the scenario. You need to understand what you need to get out of the game, craft the scenario and the game structure itself appropriately, so that you can then tell the red team how it is they should play it. Now, not all of your teams are going to be Marlon Brando, be able to play everything together. But if you're able to explain to them coherently and reasonably what it is you're trying to get out of the game, and how they should approach the problem, you will find that your red team will say, got it. I know what we're trying to do here today, and I will make my decisions in accordance with that guidance. But all of that begins with really understanding, your intended outcomes and how the red team mechanic fits into that.
Do you think about the adding? Do you ever think about adding the red team as a player to create a perception of equality or importance?
I am not sure I understand that question.
Give me a second.
If you can follow up on that.
Yeah, let me try to get a clarification on this question. But another question that we have is, what are some of the best practices if you're invited to be a red team player, right? In terms of coming into a CNA war game and adding the most value as a red team or red adversary SME?
So I think the answer to that is kind of the answer to the question I just gave, which is when you come to a game, level with the game facilitator, game control, understand what it is you want to get out of the game and how they should play and how you should play the game, right? Do they want you to give deep consideration and reveal your thinking about why the president of a country would listen to the Ministry of Defense over the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in a given circumstance? Do they need you to explain why? Do they need you to explain who's who in the zoo? Do you need to go into a description of personalities of everyone who's involved in that decision-making process? Or do they need you to hit a button and say, I'm launching a shit ton of missiles and I'm going to hit it at this target, right? So it's on both sides. The facilitator needs to coach the red team along, but a red player needs to understand what it is the game is trying, what objective the game is trying to achieve, so that they can play appropriately. And I think coming back to those different models of different kinds of red teams might be a helpful basis for thinking about the kinds of red teams that different games might need.
So another question in that regard is, one second as I get some clarification, is for the earlier question is, how do you decide which red players to be at the table, right? In terms of importance, right? Like, how do you scope in a complicated world where there are multiple adversaries, which red players are represented or which ones are just merely proxies of others?
Right. So this comes to the fundamental question of scoping your war game and what is in and what is out of scope. And this ideally should happen very early in your game design process, and in conjunction with your process of, if you're doing an analytic war game, the process of understanding why it is you're doing the game and what answers you want to get out of it. I made reference a little bit ago that I've spent a lot of time and a lot of research at CNA trying to understand our allies and partners, and that's because I'm a full-on believer that as the United States, one of our greatest assets is the networks of allies and partners that we can bring to bear to side with us when the chips are down, right? And so we need to cultivate those relationships and partnerships for many years, so that when we do need them, they are there with us. And we need to understand their needs. We need to understand their capabilities. We need to understand their desires. We need to understand how they see us and how we can help them. And all of that goes out the window immediately once I'm designing 90% of my games, because as much of a fervent believer as I am in the need to understand our partners and allies, not every game I design needs a realistic green team. And sometimes the question that you're trying to understand becomes much more convoluted when you throw in this extraneous complexity. So if your question is fundamentally about how do we construct our future force in the face of this threat, that is a very specific kind of question. And while you could craft a game that also considers our partners and allies as part of that equation, if you craft a game that has all those partners and allies making decisions in that space, it's going to make it all that more difficult for you to focus in on the questions that you want to be able to focus on in your game. So I went down the green tangent there. It was kind of a green rabbit hole, but the same rationale applies to your red team. So of course, every problem in the world is impacted by the movement of the farthest star, which has been impacted by some girl picking a flower in 1826. So everything is related to everything. But when you're doing analysis, you need to be able to scope the question. You need to be able to scope what data you're looking for and what you're not looking for. And in particular, when you're crafting a war game for analysis, you need to develop very early on what is important to you and what is not, what needs to be simulated and what can be abstracted, right? So sometimes you might not need a lot of fidelity on this aspect of decision-making, but you need to understand what is important to you and what is not. So it's the answer to your question is fundamentally about scoping and understanding what the problems are that you are trying to address with your game.
Perfect. So as I give a few more minutes for people to give some questions, I guess one of the questions I wanted to ask is how does this apply in terms of the red models that you mentioned apply to representing green and our allies and partners or other blue players, right, when they're being represented in a war game?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I really think that I almost put in a slide about that said and all of this applies to green as well. Right. So it depends on what you want to, understand, what is your fundamental question? If you are crafting a game in which you are trying to understand your partner's decision space or the decision space of your allies, you want to craft your game and your questions to focus on that. And you can use the same kinds of breakdowns that I presented for analyzing your adversaries to analyzing our partners and allies as well. So you might want to consider whether or not you're going to actually include representatives of those countries in your war game. That is definitely something that we've done. We have conducted games in other countries. In conjunction with foreign governments. We've had foreign players and representatives in our games, but that's going to be dictated by the sponsor, by the needs of that particular game. Sometimes we want to bring the actual people in. We might want to bring a representative from the UK in to make decisions on behalf of the United Kingdom player in the game, or we might want to simulate that. And the degree to which we're going to simulate it, again, I sound like a broken record, depends on what you want to get out of the war game. I have heard of a game that was a NATO game, and it was looking at a conflict involving NATO and the decision making of trying to get different NATO partners to sign on to Article 5, in a crisis leading to a conflict. And the game actually had distinct teams for every NATO country, which of course was a huge burden to go find someone who could adequately and accurately represent each NATO country, keeping in mind the fact that these all had to be U.S. nationals who weren't actually going out to to find participants from these countries. But they had a different team for each NATO country. And in addition to that, there was a survey given to every country at the end of every turn about what is driving, their decision making, for the events of that particular turn. That was done with one particular purpose, and part of achieving that objective was collecting a lot of data, right? And they collected a lot of data, a lot of perceptions from a lot of different players and a lot of different teams. And had some excellent analysis that came out of that. On the flip side, precisely because we weren't actually including real partners and allies in this, there's going to be some kind of limitation where you have to account for the gameism of that dynamic. So every way that I've outlined for how you can think about crafting an adversary red team could, in theory, be applied to a green team as well. Depends on what you want to get out of it. It might entail a lot of work up front, a lot of work at the back. And to be honest, a lot of our games are not focused on the specific details of how our partners are making decisions, but how our adversaries are making decisions tends to be a lot more important to our planning and preparation for crisis and conflict. So I think a lot of the same tools can be used. It just depends on what it is you're trying to game out.
So I finally got a clarification on that question, and it really boils down to, in your experience, has there ever been an effect where minor red players in a conflict or a war game were overly emphasized due to the fact that there were human players representing that red player comparatively to other actions represented by more important red players in a game?
Oh yeah, okay. I'm tracking now. That's a very good question, and it comes down to more of a question of facilitation of your game and how you are. And this is why facilitation is an art and a skill. It is not a science, and it is very difficult to learn. It's the same phenomenon, I think, that the questioner is asking is about the loudest mouth in the room, right? And you will find this in a lot of games and in any kind of event. Like, we all know that guy who will not shut up and has something to say about everything all the time. And just by the very fact, and it usually is a guy, right? The fact that he is willing to speak up and say something loudest first kind of dominates and drives the conversation. So that is absolutely a factor and a dynamic that you have to be aware of, that you have to learn how to manage in your war games. And I think the questioner is absolutely right that if you see this happening with your red teams, you have to be savvy to the fact that that could impact the play of the game, and it can impact the outcomes if you're trying to understand some sort of dynamic that is really important for the red team to reflect. I have been part of war games where that has been a dynamic. And I distinctly remember at one point, many, many years ago, where my boss came, we were doing the after game analysis, and he said, "Hey, so this team made this decision." And I was like, "Yeah." He says, "Was that just X person being loud?" And I was like, "Yeah, he was sitting at the computer taking notes at that time. So he just wrote that in and made that a decision for the team." And he's like, "Okay, it sounded like something he would do. So we're just going to take that into consideration as, in the context of the decision that red team made." Got it. Right. So yes, it impacts the gameplay, right? But you have to be able to understand how it's impacting the gameplay and kind of what can be taken care of post-production, if you will, right? So, you're always going to have the opportunity, in the analytic phase to be like, does that really make sense? Why did they do that? Maybe it's just because so-and-so had a loud mouth. And, you need to be aware of those dynamics, absolutely, just as you would in any kind of event. But yeah, it's a very, very good question and very on point. Appreciate it. Thank you.
So that's all the questions we have. So on behalf of Georgetown University Wargaming Society, affably known as Goose, we would like to thank you, Chris, for your wonderful presentation. And for those who missed it, this will be on YouTube later tonight. And our slides will also be on the Google Drive per usual, which can be accessed through our newsletter. So everyone in the chat, please thank Chris for his time and his generous expertise this evening during the weekday. And thank you, Chris, again for agreeing to this.
Hey, no, thank you very much, Sebastian. It was it was great to be here and very happy to talk about this.